On the morning of June 27, 2010, FBI agents stood outside a two-story colonial house in Montclair, New Jersey, preparing to arrest a couple who did not exist. The house, painted yellow with white trim, sat on Marquette Road in one of New Jersey's affluent suburbs. Inside lived Richard and Cynthia Murphy, an accountant and an MBA graduate from Columbia University, raising two daughters in what appeared to be an ordinary American family. Their names were not Richard and Cynthia Murphy. They were Vladimir and Lydia Guriev, Russian intelligence officers working for the SVR, the successor to the Soviet KGB. They were part of what Russian intelligence called the illegals program, deep cover officers operating in the United States without diplomatic protection, living entirely false identities that had taken years to construct. Before we continue with how the FBI uncovered one of Russia's most sophisticated intelligence operations, if you're interested in the hidden world of modern espionage and the real human cost of intelligence work, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We document these complex cases with the depth they deserve, separating fact from fiction in the world of international intelligence. At approximately 7:20 a.m., FBI agents executed arrest warrants simultaneously across multiple cities. In Montclair, agents approached the Murphy residence. In Yonkers, New York, they arrested Michael Zottoli and Patricia Mills. In Arlington, Virginia, they took into custody Donald Heathfield and Tracy Foley. In Manhattan, they arrested Anna Chapman. By noon, 10 suspected Russian intelligence officers had been arrested in what would become one of the largest counterintelligence operations since the Cold War ended. The Murphy arrest followed standard protocol. When agents knocked on the door, Cynthia Murphy answered, dressed for work. Arrest reports indicate she initially expressed confusion when informed she was under arrest for conspiracy to act as an unregistered agent of a foreign government. Richard Murphy was in the kitchen with their two daughters, who were preparing for school. Both parents were taken into custody without resistance. Social services personnel took custody of the children, explaining that their parents had to accompany the FBI. The girls, both elementary school age, were frightened but compliant. The arrests concluded an investigation that had begun nearly a decade earlier. In 2000, Signals Intelligence detected encrypted communications patterns suggesting Russian illegals were operating in the United States. The intercepts were fragmentary. Messages transmitted via shortwave radio, information concealed in digital images posted on public websites, suspicious contact patterns between individuals with no apparent connection. The FBI's counterintelligence division began what would become Operation Ghost Stories, a patient surveillance operation that gradually identified suspects and documented their activities. An illegal, in intelligence terminology, is an officer who operates in a foreign country without official cover, no diplomatic immunity, no embassy protection, no formal connection to their home government. Unlike diplomats who cannot be prosecuted if exposed, illegals face arrest and imprisonment if discovered. The vulnerability creates operational freedom. Diplomats are monitored constantly. But a suburban accountant living in New Jersey raises no suspicions. The illegals program had its origins in Soviet intelligence practices from the 1920s, when Soviet services began inserting officers into Western countries with manufactured identities designed to last decades. Despite the Soviet Union's dissolution in 1991 and Russia's subsequent economic crisis, the SVR quietly resumed such operations by the mid-1990s, retaining institutional memory and strategic objectives that survived political transformation. Vladimir and Lydia Guriev's transformation into Richard and Cynthia Murphy required years of preparation. Court documents indicate both received extensive training in creating fabricated personas, communicating covertly with SVR handlers, identifying intelligence sources, and operating in American society without detection. Their cover identities used real birth certificates of deceased Americans, a technique called ghost identity creation, where intelligence services locate public records of individuals who died in infancy or childhood, then use those authentic documents as foundations for constructed lives. The couple's insertion into the United States occurred sometime in the mid-1990s. Investigators believe they first established residence in Canada, obtained Canadian documents using their assumed names, then legally immigrated to the United States. Once in America, they built conventional lives with genuine elements: real jobs, real graduate degrees, real relationships with neighbors and colleagues. Their children, both born in the United States, were entirely authentic. The girls knew nothing of their parents' actual identities. They attended American schools, spoke English as their native language, and thought of themselves as ordinary American children because, from their perspective, that is exactly what they were. This intersection of authentic and fabricated elements was characteristic of the illegals program's approach. Unlike short-term operations focused on specific targets, the illegals played an extraordinarily patient game. Their value was not in what they could accomplish in months, but in the access and credibility they could develop over decades. A suburban couple living unremarkably in New Jersey for 20 years would eventually have networks extending into business, academia, and government. Patient cultivation could eventually produce intelligence opportunities that conventional espionage could not. For over a decade, the Gurievs operated without detection. However, by late 2006, the Murphy family came to FBI attention through signals intelligence and physical surveillance. Intercepted communications referenced a couple in New Jersey whose descriptions matched Vladimir and Lydia Guriev. Agents began periodic surveillance, documenting the family's routines and watching for behavior confirming suspicions. What they observed appeared entirely normal, except for occasional anomalies that accumulated into patterns suggesting covert work. Between January 2007 and May 2008, surveillance documented Richard Murphy traveling to public parks in northern New Jersey and New York, where he appeared to engage in brush contacts, brief, seemingly accidental encounters with individuals whose movements and timing suggested coordination. On 2 occasions, surveillance teams observed Murphy placing small packages in specific locations, then leaving without retrieving them. Apparent dead drops. Cynthia Murphy's activities were more difficult to monitor because she worked in Manhattan, where surveillance was complicated by crowds. However, analysis of her professional relationships identified several occasions when she met with individuals working in policy analysis and financial regulation, contacts valuable to Russian intelligence seeking to understand American economic decision-making. This intelligence collection continued for years, gradually expanding in scope. By mid-2009, the FBI had identified at least 9 other individuals across the United States who appeared to be part of the same network. Each had backgrounds revealing inconsistencies and fabrications similar to the Murphys. Each displayed behavior suggesting intelligence work. Communications intercepts indicated all were reporting to SVR handlers or meeting clandestinely with Russian intelligence officers who traveled to the United States under various pretexts. The investigation required coordination among multiple FBI field offices, extensive technical surveillance, and constant analysis. Agents had to monitor suspects without alerting them, which meant rotating personnel frequently and maintaining operational security so thorough that most FBI employees working in the same buildings had no idea the operation existed. Determining what intelligence the illegals were collecting proved challenging. Unlike dramatic Cold War cases where agents stole classified documents or photographed military installations, the illegals appeared engaged primarily in political intelligence and access agent operations. They cultivated relationships with people in policy-making institutions, academic centers, think tanks, and financial firms. They gathered information about American economic policies, political trends, and decision-making processes. Much of what they collected was not legally classified, but was valuable because it provided context and understanding unavailable from public sources. Intercepted communications revealed Cynthia Murphy had developed a relationship with a fundraiser connected to a major political figure, exactly the type of access the SVR sought for insights into American political financing and policy formation. Donald Heathfield, whose real identity investigators determined was Andrei Bezrukov, born in Russia in 1960, had established himself as a business consultant with a position at a prominent academic institution. He had access to researchers, policy analysts, and students who would eventually move into positions of influence. The sustained value of such positioning made the illegals program attractive to Russian intelligence. By early 2010, the FBI had accumulated substantial evidence but faced difficult decisions about when to act. Counterintelligence operations always balance gathering more intelligence through continued surveillance against the necessity of eventually disrupting operations. Surveillance provided insights into Russian intelligence priorities and methods. As long as the FBI monitored the situation, the network posed manageable risk. However, several factors drove the decision to arrest. First, relationships the illegals had cultivated were maturing to points where they might access genuinely sensitive information. Second, prolonged surveillance increased risk of exposure through mistakes or Russian counterintelligence detection. Third, Anna Chapman appeared to be planning departure from the United States, raising concerns the entire network might be extracted before arrests could occur. Anna Chapman, born Anna Vasilyevna Kushchenko in Volgograd, Russia, in 1982, had entered the United States in 2009 using a British passport obtained through marriage to a British citizen. Unlike older illegals who had spent decades establishing covers, Chapman appeared to be a newer network addition. FBI surveillance documented multiple meetings between Chapman and a Russian intelligence officer working under diplomatic cover at the Russian mission to the United Nations. In early June 2010, analysis indicated Chapman was making travel arrangements and preparing for departure. The operation to arrest the illegals was planned to occur simultaneously across multiple locations to prevent any member from alerting others. More than 100 FBI agents coordinated across New York, New Jersey, Virginia, and Massachusetts to ensure all arrests would occur within a narrow time window on June 27, 2010. The arrests generated international attention within hours. By afternoon, news organizations reported the FBI had arrested 10 suspected Russian spies living under assumed identities. The story had every element calculated to attract fascination: suburban families leading double lives, attractive foreign agents, Cold War-style espionage in the modern era, neighbors and colleagues deceived for years. Anna Chapman became a media sensation due to her age and appearance. Behind the public spectacle, complex diplomatic and legal processes began immediately. The arrested individuals faced serious federal charges: conspiracy to act as unregistered agents of a foreign government, carrying potential 5-year sentences with additional charges for money laundering and identity fraud that could result in decades of imprisonment. However, espionage cases rarely proceed to trial because trials require disclosure of evidence intelligence agencies prefer to keep classified. Espionage arrests often become currency in diplomatic negotiations. Within days, Russian officials signaled interest in a prisoner exchange. Russia held individuals Western intelligence wanted released, notably Igor Sutyagin, a Russian scientist imprisoned since 1999 on espionage charges for allegedly passing classified information to British intelligence, and Alexander Zaporozhsky, a former colonel in Russian intelligence who had allegedly spied for the United States and was arrested in 2001. Exchanging the arrested illegals for these prisoners was attractive to both sides. For the arrested illegals, the exchange offered return to Russia and avoidance of American prison, but carried complications. Several had children born in the United States who were American citizens. The Guriev daughters and the Bezrukov sons knew no country but America, spoke English as their native language, had friends and schools, and lives entirely American. Return to Russia meant uprooting these children and taking them to a country and culture they had no connection to, where they would not speak the language fluently. For the children, revelation of their parents' true identities was traumatic. In the immediate aftermath, social services placed them with foster families while negotiations proceeded. They were told their parents had been working for the Russian government and that their lives had been based on fabricated identities. For young children, understanding that their parents were not who they claimed, that their names were different, that their family history was constructed, was overwhelming. Psychologists who evaluated the children reported they displayed symptoms of trauma, confusion, and profound insecurity about their own identities. While the children struggled with this revelation, diplomatic negotiations proceeded rapidly. The prisoner exchange was finalized with remarkable speed. On July 8, 2010, less than 2 weeks after arrests, the 10 individuals were brought before a federal judge in New York, where they pleaded guilty to conspiracy to act as unregistered agents of a foreign government. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to pursue more serious espionage charges. Sentences were set at time served with immediate deportation to Russia. The exchange occurred in Vienna, Austria, on July 9, 2010, at Vienna International Airport. The 10 Russian illegals were exchanged for 4 individuals Russia had been holding: Igor Sutyagin, Alexander Zaporozhsky, Gennady Vasilenko, and Sergei Skripal. The exchange was conducted with procedures reminiscent of Cold War spy swaps. 2 planes on the tarmac, prisoners transferred under diplomatic supervision. Immediate departures once exchange was verified. The illegals landed in Moscow and were met with treatment suggesting Russia valued their service despite operational failure. Russian news reports indicated returning officers were decorated with state honors at a private ceremony. Vladimir Putin, himself a former KGB officer who had become Russia's prime minister, reportedly met with the illegals and praised their service. Anna Chapman became a celebrity in Russia, appearing on television, modeling for magazines, and working in various public capacities, suggesting she retained connections to Russian intelligence. For children of arrested illegals who returned to Russia with their parents, the transition was difficult. The Guriev daughters had spent their entire conscious lives as the Murphy daughters. They faced immersion in Russian culture, Russian language education, and Russian society. The adjustment was challenging. The older daughter, approximately 15 at the time, struggled with language barriers, cultural differences, and loss of her American identity and social network. Both girls faced the psychological burden of knowing their childhoods had been based on elaborate deception. The Bezrukov sons faced similar challenges. They had been slightly younger at arrest, but old enough to have formed clear identities as American children. Relocation to Russia meant leaving friends, schools, and a culture they considered their own. The enduring psychological impact of forced cultural transplantation on children who had no role in their parents' decisions would persist throughout their lives. Some illegals had no children, which simplified return but did not eliminate personal costs. Michael Zottoli and Patricia Mills, actually Mikhail Kutzik and Natalia Pereverzeva, had spent over a decade building lives in the United States, developing careers, establishing relationships, and creating identities that had become psychologically real despite being operationally false. Return to Russia meant abandoning these constructed lives and readjusting to Russian society after years immersed in American culture. The aftermath involved extensive debate about several issues. From a counterintelligence perspective, questions arose about how illegals had operated undetected for so long. Background check systems designed to identify individuals using assumed identities had failed to detect that the Murphys, Heathfield, Foley, and others were not who they claimed. The fabricated personas had been constructed using real birth certificates of deceased Americans, documents passing routine verification because they were genuine records, just not records of the people using them. This revelation prompted reviews of identity verification procedures and led to enhanced systems for cross-referencing birth records with death records to prevent ghost identity fraud. Questions also arose about the value of intelligence the illegals collected. The FBI assessment, based on intercepted communications and materials seized during arrests, concluded that while illegals had not obtained significant classified information, they had collected substantial political intelligence and positioned themselves to potentially access more sensitive material in the future. The extended nature of their mission meant full value might not have been realized for decades. Arrests disrupted this potential before it could materialize, but the SVR's investment suggested Russian intelligence assessed such operations as worthwhile despite costs and risks. From the Russian perspective, the illegals program represented continuation of intelligence doctrine, valuing human sources, sustained positioning, and deep understanding of foreign societies. Russian intelligence strategy historically emphasized patience and extended thinking. The illegals embodied this approach, investments in relationships, access, and understanding that might not pay immediate dividends but could provide strategic advantages over time. Public reaction was complex. There was fascination with dramatic aspects, attractive spies, suburban families with secret lives, real-life versions of fictional plots. However, beneath entertainment value, there was discomfort with realization that Russian intelligence had successfully placed multiple officers in American society for extended periods without detection. The fact that these individuals had been neighbors, colleagues, and community members, indistinguishable from ordinary Americans, raised questions about security, trust, and difficulty of protecting against patient, sophisticated intelligence operations. The case prompted reflection on espionage in the post-Cold War era. During the Cold War, ideological conflict between the United States and Soviet Union had been stark and existential. Espionage had been understood as part of fundamental struggle between opposing systems. The illegals arrested in 2010 were operating 2 decades after the Soviet Union's dissolution, in an era when Russia and the United States maintained diplomatic relations, when Russian and American citizens traveled freely between countries, when economic and cultural exchanges were routine. Continued operation of programs like the illegals under these conditions suggested that despite improved political relationships, Intelligence competition persisted regardless of ideological alignment. For neighbors, colleagues, and friends of arrested illegals, revelation was personally unsettling. People who had known the Murphys for years struggled to reconcile personal experiences with revelation of true identities and purposes. Some expressed feelings of betrayal. Others expressed sympathy, particularly for children caught in their parents' operations. Professional colleagues of Donald Heathfield expressed particular shock at not having detected the deception. Heathfield had worked in academic and policy circles where credentials and backgrounds were routinely scrutinized, his success maintaining cover identity in an environment where people regularly investigated claims suggested sophisticated operational security and extensive preparation. Intelligence professionals noted that detecting well-constructed fabricated personas is extraordinarily difficult when the person maintaining them has been trained specifically to withstand scrutiny. Defense Department reviews showed the case led to comprehensive security procedure changes at government agencies and defense contractors. Enhanced background check procedures were implemented, along with more frequent security reviews for employees with clearances and stricter protocols for monitoring access to classified information. Enhanced verification procedures were developed, though the fundamental challenge, distinguishing between legitimate identity documents used by legitimate people and legitimate documents used by imposters, remained difficult. From a diplomatic perspective, the rapid prisoner exchange represented both cooperation and continued competition between the United States and Russia. Both governments had interest in retrieving their respective assets and avoiding lengthy public trials that would expose intelligence methods and sources. The exchange demonstrated that despite tensions, pragmatic cooperation on specific issues remained possible. However, it also confirmed that intelligence competition was ongoing and that both countries continued operating extensive intelligence collection operations targeting each other. The case influenced popular culture, inspiring the television series The Americans, which premiered in 2013 and explored psychological complexity of Soviet intelligence officers living under deep cover in American suburbia while raising children who believed the cover was reality. For intelligence professionals, the case reinforced lessons about difficulty and importance of counterintelligence work. Detecting foreign intelligence operations in open societies like the United States is extraordinarily challenging because the openness that democracies value also creates opportunities for exploitation. Russian illegals could live in American communities, obtain American educations, work in American institutions, and develop American social networks because American society is generally open and trusting. Creating security systems that can detect sophisticated intelligence operations without becoming paranoid, intrusive, and self-defeating requires careful balance. The investigation that exposed the illegals program required nearly a decade of patient work, resources, expertise, and sustained commitment from multiple agencies. Success was largely due to signals intelligence providing crucial insights into network communications, but also because FBI counterintelligence personnel had been willing to pursue leads methodically, build comprehensive cases, and wait for the right moment rather than moving prematurely. The financial costs of operations like the illegals program, both for Russian intelligence and American counterintelligence, were substantial. The SVR invested enormous resources in creating and maintaining fabricated identities, training illegals, providing financial support, and conducting complex communications and handling operations. The FBI investigation similarly required years of surveillance, technical operations, analysis, and personnel time. These investments reflected the value both sides placed on human intelligence and strategic advantages that successful multi-year operations could provide. From Russia's perspective, exposure of the illegals program represented significant operational failure, but not necessarily strategic abandonment of the approach. Intelligence programs of this nature are designed with understanding that some operations will be detected and officers may be arrested. Existence of multiple independent networks, each unaware of others, provides resilience against such losses. The 10 illegals arrested in 2010 likely represented only a portion of Russian intelligence officers operating under deep cover, with others remaining undetected. Declassified intelligence assessments indicated Russian officials, in limited public comments following the case, suggested the illegals program continued and that exposure of one network did not represent the program's end. This assessment was supported by subsequent cases where individuals suspected of being Russian illegals were identified in European countries, suggesting the SVR maintained similar operations beyond the United States. For the children of arrested illegals, particularly those born in the United States, consequences were profound. In some cases, children eventually chose to return to the United States once they reached adulthood and could make independent decisions about where to live. However, their relationships with their parents remained complicated by the fundamental deception that had defined their childhoods. Growing up believing you are an ordinary American child, then discovering your parents were Russian intelligence officers operating under constructed identities, that your name might not be your real name, that your family history was fabricated, this creates identity confusion and trust issues that persist beyond the immediate crisis. The case raised questions about what to do with children born to foreign intelligence officers operating under assumed identities. The Murphy and Heathfield children were American citizens by birth, with all rights citizenship entails. However, their parents were foreign nationals who had been in the United States illegally, using fraudulent documents and fabricated personas. When parents were deported, what obligation did the United States have to the children? In the immediate aftermath, social services worked with attorneys representing children's interests to determine the best course. Ultimately, children were given the option to remain in the United States if alternative care could be arranged, or to accompany parents to Russia. The children, still young and emotionally attached to their parents despite revelations, generally chose to remain with their parents. However, this choice was made under extraordinary circumstances, with limited time for consideration, and in the aftermath of trauma. The broader significance of the illegals program case extends beyond specific individuals arrested in 2010. The case demonstrated that Cold War-era intelligence methods remain relevant in the contemporary security environment, that patient intelligence operations continue despite dramatic changes in global politics and technology, and that the fundamental challenge of distinguishing between what is genuine and what is fabricated in open societies persists. For the American public, the case provided a rare glimpse into reality of contemporary intelligence operations, which more often resemble the methodical, patient work of the illegals program than dramatic action of fictional spy stories. Real espionage involves years of routine, careful cultivation of sources, maintenance of cover identities, and painstaking efforts to avoid detection. Success is measured not in spectacular coups, but in gradual accumulation of understanding, access, and influence. The case asks uncomfortable questions about the price of security, persistence of espionage in nominally peaceful times, and impossible choices faced by intelligence officers who must decide whether duty justifies personal sacrifices it demands. not just their own sacrifices, but those imposed on people who never chose the intelligence profession, never signed on for deception, and never deserved the consequences. Vladimir and Lydia Guriev were in their 30s when they entered the United States as Richard and Cynthia Murphy. They were in their 40s when arrested. They returned to Russia, having spent their adult lives maintaining a fiction that had become, in many ways, their reality. Their daughters, who knew them only as the Murphys, had to learn to know them as the Gurievs. The accommodation between these identities, who they had been, who they had pretended to be, who they became after the pretense ended, remains the most profound legacy of the illegals program. The case of the illegals program remains instructive for understanding contemporary intelligence operations, challenges of counterintelligence in open societies, and human costs of espionage. It demonstrates that despite technological advances and political changes, human intelligence remains valuable, that nations continue investing in patient operations, and that the most difficult aspect of intelligence work may be not the collection of information, but the personal cost of deception required to collect it. On June 27, 2010, 10 people living fabricated identities in the United States were arrested, charged, and within weeks exchanged for prisoners held by Russia. Some had children who were American citizens forced to choose between remaining in America without parents or accompanying parents to a country foreign to them. Those children carried forward the complicated legacy of parents who loved them genuinely while deceiving them fundamentally about who they were, a reminder that intelligence operations, however strategic their objectives, create human costs that persist beyond the operations themselves.